All right, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into the world of Palantir Technologies.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
They're one of those companies that are kind of shrouded in mystery, right? You hear about them helping governments catch terrorists,
Yeah,
but then they're also working with businesses on things like supply chains and helping banks fight fraud.
it's a fascinating mix.
It is. It really is. And all of it's powered by their data analytics
Hmm.
platforms. But a company with this much reach, obviously it's going to stir up some controversy.
No doubt about that.
So to really get a handle on this, we've got two main sources we're looking at today. First, we've got Palantir's own investor relations material, which, expectedly paints a pretty rosy picture.
Sure, sure.
And then we've got this independent stock analysis report that takes a bit more of a critical view.
Always good to have multiple perspectives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our goal today is to kind of cut through all the hype and figure out what Palantir really does.
Get to the nitty-gritty.
Yes, exactly. How do they make money? And the big question, of course, is all the excitement around their stock actually justified? What do you think? Is it just hype or is there something more there?
Well, that's what we're here to find out, right? But I'll say this, Palantir isn't just your run-of-the-mill data analytics company. They've really carved out this unique space for themselves, especially early on when they were heavily focused on that government sector.
Right, dealing with some really sensitive data.
Exactly. We're talking counterterrorism, intelligence gathering, that whole world. And what's really interesting is that they've managed to take that expertise and translate it over to the commercial side, helping businesses solve all sorts of complex problems by finding hidden patterns in their data.
So they're like data detectives.
In a way, yeah, they're all about connecting the dots that others might miss.
I like that. But let's get a bit more specific. Their investor materials talk about turning mountains of data into actionable insights. What does that actually look like in practice? I mean, can you give us a real-world example?
Well, imagine you've got tons of information scattered all over the place, right? Different databases, spreadsheets, reports. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, but without the picture on the box to guide you.
That sounds pretty overwhelming.
It can be, but that's where Palantir comes in. Their platforms provide the framework, the algorithms to connect all those disparate pieces and actually reveal that bigger picture.
So they provide the missing puzzle box.
Yeah, you could say that. But what really sets them apart is their approach. They're rooted in something called ontology.
Ontology, okay. I'm not familiar with that.
It's essentially a way of representing knowledge and relationships within the data. So their platforms don't just see the data as raw numbers and facts. They actually understand how it's all connected. And that's where they really shine, uncovering those hidden connections that lead to insights.
So it's not just about what the data is saying, it's how it all relates to everything else.
Exactly. Relationships are key.
Okay, so we've got these powerful platforms. We know they're working in both government and commercial sectors. Can you give us some concrete examples of what they're actually doing in each of those areas?
Sure. On the government side, a lot of their work is understandably classified, but we know they've been involved in some pretty high-profile counterterrorism operations, helping agencies like the CIA and NSA analyze intelligence data to track down threats. There have even been reports of them being used for disaster response, optimizing resource allocation in emergencies.
So it's not just about catching bad guys. They're actually helping save lives, too.
Potentially, yes. They're all about making sense of complex situations and helping make better decisions faster.
Pretty impressive stuff.
It is. And on the commercial side, they're using those same skills, that same data integration and analysis to solve all sorts of business problems. For instance, they're working with financial institutions to detect fraud by analyzing transaction patterns and identifying anything that looks suspicious.
Oh, like those weird charges that pop up on your credit card statement.
Yeah, exactly. But on a much larger scale, of course. They're also working with companies to optimize their supply chains, using data to predict demand, track inventory, and make everything run more efficiently.
So it's all about efficiency and optimization, making things run smoother, whether it's a government agency or a Fortune 500 company.
That's a good way to put it. And judging by their financials, it seems like they're doing something right. Their revenue growth has been phenomenal.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. In 2024 alone, their revenue jumped by almost 29% year over year, and that's on top of consistent growth in the previous years.
And what's even more remarkable is that they finally turned a profit in 2024. They went from a net loss to a net income of over $462 million.
And their earnings per share landed at $0.19. So with numbers like that, you'd think investors would be over the moon, right?
You'd think so, yeah. And they are, to a certain extent. But there's a bit of a catch. The market's valuation of Palantir is incredibly high, even considering their strong performance. We're talking about a price-to-earnings ratio of over 548.
Wow, okay. That is a big number. But for someone who's maybe not a financial expert, what does that actually mean? What does it tell us about how investors are viewing Palantir?
Well, it basically means that investors are betting big on Palantir's future. That PE ratio suggests they're expecting exponential growth, even more than what we've seen so far. And with that kind of expectation comes a lot of risk. If Palantir's growth even slightly falters, that stock price could plummet.
So it's like everyone's assuming Palantir will become the Google of data analytics.
Hmm.
But is that a realistic expectation?
It's certainly possible. They've got the technology, they've got the expertise, and they're operating in a market that's only going to get bigger. But there are also a lot of things that could go wrong, and that high valuation makes them extremely sensitive to any setbacks.
So it's a bit of a gamble. High potential rewards, but also high potential risks.
Exactly. It's a high-stakes game.
All right, so we've got this company with a unique approach to data analytics, strong financials, but also a valuation that's raising some eyebrows. Now, let's talk about their cash flow, because that's another important piece of the puzzle. What's the situation there?
Well, here's where things get interesting. Palantir is actually generating a lot of cash. In 2024, their operating cash flow was over $1.1 billion, and they have very little debt and a healthy amount of cash on hand.
Okay, so that sounds like a good thing. Plenty of cash to invest in future growth, right?
Absolutely. It gives them a lot of flexibility to expand their operations, maybe acquire other companies, or even just weather any storms that might come their way. But here's where that high valuation comes back to haunt us.
Ah, I was wondering when that would come up again.
If their cash flow slows down, even a little bit, investors might panic, and that stock price could take a nosedive. They're under a lot of pressure to keep those numbers up.
So it's a double-edged sword. Strong cash flow is great, but it also means they're constantly under the microscope.
Exactly. The stakes are high.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the risks. Because no company, no matter how successful, is without them. What are some of the biggest challenges Palantir faces moving forward?
Well, we've already touched on a few. That sky-high valuation is probably the biggest one. But there are others to consider as well, like competition and their reliance on government contracts.
Let's unpack those a bit more. Who are they competing with, and how did that reliance on government contracts play into things?
They're not just competing with other data analytics startups. They're also going up against some of the biggest tech companies in the world. Google, Amazon, Microsoft. These giants have vast resources, and they're constantly expanding into new markets, including data analytics.
So how does a company like Palantir, even with its impressive technology, stand a chance against those behemoths?
Well, their advantage lies in their specialized expertise and their focus on really complex data problems. They've got a proven track record, especially in that government sector, of handling highly sensitive data and delivering results. And that's something those big tech companies can't easily replicate. They don't have that same level of experience in those specific areas.
Yeah, so experience and a niche focus give them an edge. But what about that reliance on government contracts? How much of a risk is that?
It's definitely a factor to consider. Government contracts can be lucrative, but they're also subject to political changes and budget cuts. And we're not talking about your average contracts here. These are complex, long-term engagements. It's not like they can just pivot to a new market overnight if they lose a major government client.
So they need to be thinking about diversifying their revenue stream, building a stronger presence in the commercial world.
Exactly. And they have made some progress there, but it's still a work in progress.
This is already a lot to take in, and we've just scratched the surface. But before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to talk about Palantir's culture, because it's been the subject of a lot of discussion, and not always in a positive light. They've been called secretive, demanding, even a bit cult-like. What's your take on their culture, and how might it impact their future?
Well, it's true that Palantir has a very unique culture. They're intensely focused on their mission, and that's led to a culture of hard work, long hours, and a certain level of secrecy. And it's important to remember that the company was founded in the shadow of 9/11 with a mission to prevent future terrorist attacks. So that context is important.
So it's a culture born out of a very specific set of circumstances, a response to a very real threat.
Exactly. And that culture has served them well in many ways. It's fostered a strong sense of camaraderie and a relentless drive to solve complex problems. But as Palantir grows and expands into new markets, they'll need to find a way to balance that core culture with the need for greater transparency and adaptability. The world is changing, and they need to change with it.
It's a delicate balance, holding on to what makes them unique while also evolving to meet the demands of a changing world.
Precisely. And it's one that will be closely watched by investors, employees, and the public alike. Their culture will play a big role in shaping their future, one way or another. Welcome back to our deep dive into Palantir technologies. Just a quick reminder that we're looking at Palantir from different angles here. We've got their own investor materials and an independent stock analysis report. Kind of gives us two sides of the same coin.
Right, like having two different lenses to examine them through.
Exactly. So far, we've learned some pretty fascinating things about how they approach data analytics, how well they're doing financially, and some of the potential risks they might face down the line. But let's dive a little deeper into that whole competitive landscape because Palantir isn't operating in a bubble, right?
Yeah, definitely not. And like we touched on earlier, they've got some pretty heady hitters to contend with, not just other data analytics companies, but also those mega tech giants everyone knows.
The Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts of the world.
Exactly. Those guys have resources coming out of their ears and are always looking to expand their empires.
So almost like a David versus Goliath situation. How can a company like Palantir, even with their impressive technology, manage to hold their own against those giants?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. They're not trying to be everything to everyone, right? Palantir's carved out this niche by focusing on what they do best, solving those super complex data problems that others just can't seem to crack.
Right, they go for the really tough stuff.
Yeah, exactly. They're experts at taking data from all sorts of different sources, even when it's messy and disorganized and spread out across different systems and making sense of it. That's where their ontology-based approach really shines. They don't just look at the data points themselves, they understand how it's all connected underneath.
Okay, so they're specialists, not generalists. Got it. But their investor materials talk a big game about AI and machine learning. Are they actually pushing the boundaries there, or is it more sizzle than steak?
That's a great question. While they definitely utilize AI and machine learning in their platforms, their focus seems to be less on developing groundbreaking algorithms and more about applying existing technologies in new and innovative ways to solve real-world problems.
So it's more about using the tools that are already out there in clever ways.
Precisely. Their strength lies in taking those existing algorithms and integrating them into their systems, making them user-friendly and accessible for their clients. This is especially helpful for their government clients who are working with highly sensitive data.
So practicality and application over just chasing the latest AI fads. Makes sense. But how do they ensure they stay ahead of the curve in such a fast-paced field? What's innovative today is old news tomorrow, right?
Absolutely. That's the constant challenge in the tech world. They need to be constantly adapting and evolving. From what we see in their investor materials, they are investing in research and development, focusing on things like predictive analytics and automated decision making.
Trying to anticipate what's coming next.
Right. But it's not just about the tech itself, it's also about strategic partnerships. They're collaborating with companies and institutions at the forefront of AI research, which gives them access to cutting-edge developments that they can then integrate into their own platforms.
Kind of like building an ecosystem, leveraging the strengths of others to boost their own capabilities. Smart move. Now, let's circle back to those government contracts for a second. We talked about them as a potential risk earlier, but what are the advantages they offer Palantir? Why not just go all in on the commercial market?
Well, government contracts, especially in the areas where Palantir operates, tend to be pretty large-scale and long-term. That brings a certain level of stability and predictability to their revenue stream, which is super important for a company that's still in a growth phase.
Right, like a safety net.
Exactly. Plus, working with government agencies, particularly those in defense and intelligence, gives them access to unique data sets and real-world problems that they can use to refine their technology.
Almost like a testing ground for their platforms, pushing them to come up with solutions for some of the most difficult data problems out there.
Yeah, you could say that. They're working on the cutting edge, for sure.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned the risks of relying too much on these government contracts can be a bit of a tightrope walk.
Right, we talked about that. Things can change quickly in the political landscape, budgets get cut, priorities shift.
Exactly. There's always that possibility of losing a major contract, and it's not easy to replace them. It takes time to build those relationships and navigate all the red tape. So they're walking that fine line, enjoying the perks of government work, but also knowing they need to diversify and build a stronger presence in the commercial sector.
Makes sense. They need to show commercial clients that the technology they've honed in the government sector All that experience with sensitive data and complex problems can also be applied to the business world and bring them tangible benefits.
Exactly. Like, hey, what works for catching terrorists can also work for optimizing your supply chain or catching financial fraud. It's an interesting proposition for sure.
Definitely. Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, their company culture. It's been called intense, secretive, even a bit cultish. What's your perspective on that? How do you think it could impact them moving forward?
It's true. Their culture is definitely unique, even for Silicon Valley. There's a huge emphasis on their mission, pushing boundaries, working crazy hours to solve these tough problems, and that intensity can be both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, a dedicated workforce is great, but too much intensity can lead to burnout.
Exactly. That kind of commitment can drive innovation and get results, especially when you're dealing with complex challenges. But it can also lead to burnout, high turnover, and difficulty attracting a diverse range of talent.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, maintaining the good parts of their culture that drive and focus, while also creating a more balanced and inclusive environment.
Exactly. It's a challenge that a lot of high-growth tech companies face, and how Palantir handles it will be a big factor in their future success.
All right, welcome back to our final look at Palantir Technologies. We spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into what they do, how they make money, who they're up against, and even that, well, let's say unique company culture they have.
It's been a fascinating journey for sure.
It really has. But now I want to shift gears and look ahead. What's next for Palantir? What are those key factors that'll decide whether they make it big or stumble in the coming years?
Well, we've already talked about a few of those, but it's definitely worth revisiting them in this context, thinking about the future. First and foremost, they absolutely have to keep that growth going. Remember that pretty crazy valuation we talked about?
Yeah, hard to forget a number like that.
Exactly. Investors are banking on that growth continuing, maybe even speeding up. If they miss the mark, if revenue slows down, or they don't meet those expectations, well, that stock price could really take a hit.
So a lot of pressure to keep performing, not just for investors, but for their own sake too. But growth isn't everything, right?
Right. And that brings us to the next big thing, staying ahead of the curve when it comes to innovation, especially in a field like data analytics that's changing so fast.
Like what's cutting edge today is practically ancient history tomorrow.
Exactly. Their investor materials talk a lot about AI and machine learning, and like we said before, it's not just about having the most advanced algorithms, it's about how they use them, how they integrate those technologies into their existing platforms, and how they make them actually useful for their clients. They have to keep showing that they're not just keeping up, but that they're pushing the limits of what's possible with data.
It's about being leaders, not followers.
Right. And they have to do all of this while navigating, well, a pretty complex and ever-changing world, right? The competition is fierce, and the ethical questions around data privacy and all that, those are only going to get bigger.
That's a lot to juggle.
It really is. They need to stay strong in the government sector, where they've already made a name for themselves, but also prove they can bring value to the commercial world, where there's a lot more competition. And they have to do it all in a way that acknowledges people's concerns about data privacy and how powerful these technologies can be. It's a balancing act, for sure.
So big challenges, but also big opportunities. Now, given everything we've learned about Palantir, the good and the bad, if you were an investor, would you put your money into Palantir?
Ooh, that's the million-dollar question. And I wish there was an easy answer. On the one hand, they've got a lot going for them. Unique approach to data. They're in a market that's growing like crazy. And they've got a pretty solid track record, especially in that high-stakes world of government intelligence.
So check.
But there are those risks, and they're not small. That valuation is a big one, like a flashing warning sign. The competition's not going anywhere. And those ethical concerns, those are real, and they're not going away.
So it's the classic high risk, high reward scenario.
Exactly. At the end of the day, whether you invest or not, that comes down to your own appetite for risk and what you're hoping to get out of your investments. There's no right or wrong answer here.
That's fair. But I think we can both agree that Palantir is a company worth keeping an eye on. Whether you end up investing or not, they're doing some really interesting things.
Oh, absolutely. They're at the forefront of a revolution, dealing with some of the biggest issues we're facing today, and their story is far from over.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So to wrap up our deep dive into Palantir Technologies, I think the biggest takeaway is this. They're a company that's pushing boundaries, but also facing big questions about how they use their power and what their role in this increasingly data-driven world will be. What do you think? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment, join the discussion online, and until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.